Awesome, guys. Well, I'm so excited to be with you. Hopefully you had a good time discussing that community time question, because here's what I found to be true. There are typically two different types of people in the world. People who like certain types of movies that I would call nonfiction movies or books, rather. Both kind of fall in the same category. And then there are those of us who like more of your fictional books or movies, right? So what I mean, nonfiction being based on truth, right? Maybe like your biographies, your documentaries. Even I think these kind of fit in nonfiction. How about based on a true story? Like, we all know what that means, though, right? Like based on a true story might mean the characters have the same names, but that's about it. Like, we don't really know what's actually true in the story and what's not. Like, most of it's probably fictional after Hollywood gets their hands on it, right? So there's these two types of movies or books. There's nonfiction and there's fictional. What I found is most of us tend to gravitate towards one genre or the other, right? Like most of us, we either like our fictional books and fictional movies, right? Like we have a bookshelf full of like Harry Potters and Nicholas Sparks and all of that kind of stuff, where it's more, we live in the fictional land of things. We just like that, right? How many of you guys would think you fall in that category? How many of you like fictional type stuff? Okay, your Lord of the Rings type stuff, all of that stuff, which, whatever, Lord of the Rings is no good. Don't listen to Dylan, all right? But anyways, and then there's those of us who likes your non-fictional type movies. These are more like your documentaries, your more realistic movies, your biographies, and even some based on a true story. How many of you guys kind of fall in that category, like more realistic movies? I'm kind of in that category myself. Typically, your nonfiction folks, we typically are more right-brain type people, meaning we're more logic-driven. Like we're naturally skeptical of stuff that's not real. That's just kind of us. However, those of us who like more of your fictional type movies and books, you're more of the dreamer kind, right? You kind of live in this fantasy land in a lot of ways, and you long for that happily ever after ending, right? Like you're not satisfied with how reality is if it doesn't have a happily ever after ending. And so that's what I know to be true. And so we find ourselves in these two camps. Now, the reason that I point that out this morning is to kind of get our brain working, because the problem that we have oftentimes when it comes to viewing Jesus is we miss the forest for the trees. Like we see Jesus, we say, yes, I believe that he's real. But depending on how we're wired, I think oftentimes we can misinterpret, maybe even misapply the life and the person of Jesus. For example, the main point today we're going to talk about is that Jesus himself was actually born, he actually died, and he actually rose again from the dead. This isn't a historical event. It actually happened. So how we view this event is very different than how you watch a fictional movie, right? When you watch a fictional movie, typically you don't walk away and say, man, that movie changed my life, do you? It's more of an entertainment thing, right? You enjoy watching it. Sure is good for the 2 or 2.5 hours, or in the Lord of the Rings case, 5 hours, or however long those movies are. But you walk away from it and you're entertained, but there's not a lot of life change. Now, when it comes to nonfiction, though, nonfiction can have a bigger impact in your life, right? Like, for example, if you watch a documentary on maybe World War II, for example, and you see the atrocities that Hitler committed, right? And you see the valiant bravery of all of those men who charged the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, right? You see those type of things, and it can have a profound impact on you, right? It can change you. And so how we view Jesus is particularly important, because guess what? It's nonfiction. It's true. It actually happened. It's an event in history. In fact, I was having a real conversation right here recently with our teenagers at Encounter Student Ministry. And one of the things that we talked about that night was this fact. Being a Christian doesn't necessarily mean that we follow a certain ethic, we live a certain way, we look a certain way. The primary definition of being a Christian means that we believe and follow the true message of Jesus. Do you believe it? That's what defines you as a Christian or not. This true story that actually happened a little over 2,000 years ago. Do you believe it? See, most people think Christianity is just another religion in the pot of religions that gives good advice, that tells you how to live, that helps you to be a good moral person. First and foremost, though, Christianity is not good advice. It's news. It's good news. In fact, you guys can write this down. Christianity is not primarily about giving good advice. It's about declaring good news. It's about declaring good news. Now, there's a big difference between advice and news, isn't there? I think we all would agree with that. Advice is counsel about what you should do. News, though, news is something that's already been done. See the difference? Advice urges you to make something happen. News tells you that something has already happened. You with me? There's a big difference between the two. In fact, what we're reading from this morning is a factual account. It's news to be declared. So we're going to be looking at Matthew this morning, the Gospel of Matthew, and we're starting with the very first chapter, very first verse of the New Testament part of your Bible, which is the second half of the Bible. If you don't have a Bible with you, we're going to put it on the screen. By the way, anybody that's new in here that don't have a good, easy-to-read version of the Bible, we keep free ones at the Connection Center. Stop by there afterwards. We'd love to give you one. We have them in English and Spanish. Take a free Bible and dig into Matthew 1 with us, okay? But Matthew 1, chapter 1, verse 1 starts out like this. It starts as actual factual news. So you guys read along with me. It says, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. All right, it doesn't start out like a fictional setting. It starts out at this really happened, okay? This is the genealogy of Jesus. So there's a big difference between news and advice. So let me give you an example here that I think will help illustrate this a bit. Let's say we were to flash back, say, a couple hundred years or so before modern day communication and transportation were in place. And we were in a wartime setting. Now, in a wartime setting, typically the generals or those in charge of that particular battle would not be on the battlefield themselves. They would be off from a distance, right? And they would be receiving live updates on what was going on so that they can make strategic decisions on what to do about that battle, right? Now, let's say this happened. Let's say the generals were around the campfire and they were planning and strategically trying to figure out what would be next in their next move, right, in that particular battle. And let's say a messenger came. And a messenger came and said, hey, you won't believe what just happened. We actually overtook the enemy and the battle is over. The battle is over. It's done. We have taken over the enemy. We have destroyed them and they have fled the scene. The battle is over. This changes everything, doesn't it? A factual account of news received by the generals changes the entire battle for them, right? In the same way, for us, Matthew 1 starts out as, hey, this is news. This is something that's actually happened, and you need to take note, and you need to adjust your life accordingly. So there's a big difference between news and advice. This news tells you a new day has dawned. The Messiah is here. We're going to unpack that in just a moment, but it's good news for every single one of us. You see, religion tells you what you should do. Christianity tells you what has already been done. It's a very big difference, and I hope that you see it this morning. Tim Keller, who I must give a lot of credit to for this series, actually a lot of the ideas for this series, A New Day, came from one of his books. He said this about this subject. He said, the founders of the great religions say, in one way or another, I am here to show you the way of spiritual reality. Do all of this. That's advice. Jesus Christ, the founder of Christianity, comes and says something very different. He says, I am spiritual reality itself. You can never come up to me, and therefore I had to come down to you. That is news. You see the difference between news and advice? There's a very big difference between the two. See, beginning with Jesus isn't about turning over a new leaf or adopting a new ethic. It's about believing a report, believing a message, believing a historical event that actually happened. And it all begins right here with the genealogy of Jesus. Now, I'll be honest with you, reading through a genealogy is pretty tough. If you've ever tried reading a genealogy, like in the Bible, there's quite a few of them. It could be a little on the boring side, all right? So, and we're going to endure through this one in just a moment. But I promise you there are some significant features in these genealogies that's very important for us not to miss, all right? So when it comes to a genealogy of Jesus, though, what would we expect? Like, if Jesus is the Son of God, you would expect a pretty awesome genealogy, right? Like, I'm talking like top-notch dudes along the way, maybe some kings, some mighty warriors, whatever. You would probably have a pretty good family lineup. It wouldn't be like a lot of our family genealogies, right? If you start thinking about your genealogy, there's some crazy Uncle Johnnies in that genealogy, isn't there? Like you got some kind of whacked out grandmas down the line a few generations that you're not so proud of, right? I think all of us have genealogies like that. And what's surprising about this genealogy, you're going to see, you would expect to see a perfect genealogy if you were making this up. But what you're going to see is exactly the opposite. You're going to see a genealogy filled with people that are messy, filled with some crazy Uncle Johnnies, right? And as we're going to see, some crazy grandmas, okay? Sorry, no offense. We got a couple Johnnies in here today. So this is what we're going to see today, okay? We're going to see this. So as we read through this genealogy, first of all, bear with me. A lot of names you can't pronounce. I can't pronounce half of them, but I'm going to give it my best shot today, okay? And you're going to be reading this and you're thinking, what is the point of all this? I promise you we're going to point out some significant names that are featured in this genealogy, and we're going to tie a bow on it. But what we're going to see is that this genealogy starts with a guy named Abraham. Now, Abraham wasn't the first person ever born. So obviously the point of the author here isn't to show the genealogy all the way back to the beginning of creation. There's something very specific he's trying to point out with his genealogy. Now, this book of Matthew was written primarily to a Jewish audience, which is significant because for the Jews, they knew their great-great-great-great-granddaddy who started it all was a guy named Abraham. So for Matthew, what he's trying to do is he's trying to show a Jewish audience something very significant. So he starts with their great-great-great-great-granddaddy named Abraham, and he works his way all the way to Jesus. You see, for the Jews, they knew this. We might not know it if we're not as biblically literate as they were. They knew their Old Testament. Before Jesus, they had been predicting for years and years and years to come that there would be this person who would come who would be the Messiah. Okay? Now, Messiah is not a word we use a lot today, but Messiah means the anointed one or the chosen one. And so there was this prophecy or prediction for years and years that there was coming this Messiah, this anointed one, who was going to be a game changer. When he comes, it's going to be a new day because he's going to bring salvation to the world. And so what Matthew's trying to point out primarily in this genealogy is the Messiah is here. The Messiah is here. See, it was predicted that he would come from Abraham. Well, guess what? I'm showing you where Jesus came from Abraham and so on and so forth. But there's some other details in here that I want to point out. So we're just going to read through it, okay? We're going to read through it, and I'll be honest, it's going to feel like reading through a phone book. It can feel a little weird, all right? How many of you, by the way, still have a phone book in your house? Anybody? Hey, we got a few folks still with phone books. How about this? You teenagers, how many of you actually know what a phone book is? A few of you, okay, all right. So phone books are kind of like dinosaurs. They're pretty much extinct now, but a few people still have a few hanging out there. We've moved to cell phones these days, but anyway, so let's read this genealogy, okay? So we'll read a few verses. You guys read along with me. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac, the father of Jacob. Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. We're going to come back to these underlined statements in just a few moments. Let's keep reading. Perez, the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Amminadab. Amminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon, or salmon if you think he's kin to a fish. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, or we'll come back to her in a moment. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Come back to her in a moment. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. We will also come back to her in just a moment. Dylan, could you grab me that water? Because this name list is about to get my throat, I do believe. Solomon, the father of Rehoboam. Rehoboam, the father of Abijah. Abijah, the father of Asa. Thank you. Asa, the father of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat, the father of Jehoram. Jehoram, the father of Uzziah. Uzziah, the father of Jotham. Jotham, the father of Ahaz. Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah. Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh. Manasseh, the father of Amon. Amon, the father of Josiah. And Josiah, the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the exile of Babylon. After the exile of Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of. This is where the names get really more difficult. So if you see me get tongue tied, I apologize. Shealtiel, the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, the father of Abihud. Abihud, the father of Eliakim, the father of Azor, the father of Zadok, the father of Achim, the father of Elihud, the father of Eleazar, the father of Mathan, the father of Jacob. And here we go, the people you may know. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, and the husband of Mary. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Thus, there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from exile to Messiah. We made it. We made it. We did it. All right, let me take a sip of water. I think I deserve a sip of water after that. What do y'all think? All right. So, if your kids do bad things at school, make them write this about 50 times. All right, they'll have them all down in a matter of a few minutes. All right. So there's tons of interesting things about this genealogy. We won't go into all of them today, but there's some significant names that I want to point out today because there's a thread in this that I believe will be life-changing for many of us in here. So God had promised the Messiah is going to come, and here in this genealogy, we see the thread throughout it that this is the Messiah who's coming through the lineage that was promised. Now, the biggest thing that I want to make sure, again, we don't miss today is this is a real genealogy. Like, this isn't made up. And the reason I point this out, guys, is because I grew up with this kind of mindset that, yeah, you say it's real, but it seems more like it's not real. But no, this stuff is real. These people actually existed. This Messiah was actually born. His name was Jesus. We have historical evidence for it. This is real stuff. So this is a big deal for us because what Matthew is saying is that salvation is here. It's here. His name is Jesus, okay? But what else do we see in this genealogy? So genealogies in that time period almost serve like a modern day resume, right? So for us, if you want to go get a new job, what do you have to do? You have to put together a resume. In that resume, you want to highlight basically how awesome you are, right? You don't want to put like stuff that makes you look not so good. Like, for instance, if you failed the 11th grade 3 times, you don't put that in your resume, do you? No. If you got fired from your last 2 jobs because you kept oversleeping, like you don't put that kind of stuff on your resume, do you? You only put the good stuff, right? So you would think if this was fabricated and they were putting together Jesus' resume, which is essentially what a genealogy is, then you would only put down those names that brought you honor, made you look good, right? But that's not what we see here. It's not what we see at all. In fact, we see it almost looks purposeful that the author here, Matthew, is putting in names that you don't have to include that are shameful. Now let's look through those just for a moment because I believe there's some significance here that we need to point out. And I believe there's something the author is trying to communicate to us that we can't miss this morning. So let's take a look at this first verse that we had underlined, verse 3. It says this, Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Now, this is an interesting fact here. The fact that there are women in this genealogy should tell us something. Because now in our modern context, sure, right? You include grandpa and grandma. If you're going to look at a family tree, it has grandpa and grandma and their kids. In that day and time, this is a very patriarchal culture, right? So in a typical genealogy, you'd only have the men. So the fact that there are women in here, first of all, should stand out to someone reading this. But secondly, these aren't like the most awesome women to include in this list. This isn't like, well, I think all of us probably have that like saint grandma, maybe down the line a little bit. Maybe it's your immediate grandma or great grandma or somebody. But we typically, when we typically think of a grandma you include in your family lineage, you typically think it's going to be an awesome one. It's not the case in this story. In fact, it starts out here with Tamar. If you don't know the story of Tamar, guys, hey, listen, young and the restless, bold and the beautiful, none of those can hold a candle to the story of Tamar. So Tamar has quite the journey. Okay, I'm going to give you a quick summary of a very long story. So here's Tamar. Tamar got married to a guy who was a son of Judah. So Judah would have been her father-in-law. You with me? Judah's the father-in-law of Tamar. Now, Tamar was married for a little while. Well, her husband died. Before they had children, her husband died. Now, this is a big deal in that culture because to have children was like everything to a family, specifically the wife. So the fact that she did not have children with her first husband was a big deal. And so what was the cultural expectation in that time period is if you didn't have children specifically, you would actually then be married to your husband's brother if he had a brother, okay? And that brother would help you raise a family and have family so you can actually have kids. So Judah did what was expected in the culture. Judah selected one of his other sons to then marry Tamar. So this is number 2. This son also died, okay? So Judah at this point had to have been wondering, like, I don't know what kind of meals you're cooking at home or whatever's going on, but something's going on bad. So Judah decides that he's not going to pick a third son to marry Tamar. Now, this is a problem for Tamar, right? Because she doesn't have children, and now her father-in-law, who's supposed to be the one to help her basically find a husband, now is not allowing her to remarry. And here she is in the most shameful thing for her. She can't have children and she doesn't have a husband. So she decides to take matters into her own hands. This is where it gets very interesting. So Tamar decides to act like a prostitute. And I'm going to keep this very PG, so you guys be aware. You have to fill in the details in between here. Now, in that time period, prostitutes were very different than today. Today, you want to wear as least clothes as you can. Then you actually wanted to wear as most clothes as you can so that no one knew who you were. In fact, a prostitute would very rarely take their veil off so that no one actually knew who they were. So Tamar dressed as a prostitute and went and stood at the corner where she knew Judah would cross through, her father-in-law. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So Judah takes home her. You can fill in the details from there, okay? Well, a few weeks later, word got out that there was a baby bump showing. All right? Now, obviously, that's not exactly how it happened, but you get where I'm going. She was pregnant. Now, Judah said, what? My daughter-in-law, who's not married, should not be pregnant. Let's kill her. Because that was kind of the standard of the day. If you're out checking up, you get punished for that. And so they were going to kill her. Well, Tamar had, when she was with Judah, she had kept his ring from him. All right? So you know what she did? She actually, through a messenger, sent that ring back to Judah and said, hey, Judah, the person or the baby's daddy that's in my belly is the owner of this ring. Tell me that ain't savage. Like, if you follow that, that's savage. Like, that's like, I mean, that's crazy. So basically she was saying, you're the baby daddy, so you better not kill me, all right? So this is Tamar's story. So you're thinking, like, of all the women to exclude from Jesus' genealogy, why would you not exclude her? She was a liar. She was a prostitute. She was savage, whatever word you want to throw in there. This is not the typical woman you would expect to be in Jesus' genealogy. Let's look down a little further. There's a couple more women we want to highlight. Look at verse 5. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Rahab was not much better. Rahab was a prostitute. She was a liar. But what's interesting about Rahab is she was chosen from a very evil city, if you will, that God was going to destroy. She was chosen to be delivered from that city out of God's grace. All right, so here we have another mother who doesn't have a very great past. Then look on, it says Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Now, Ruth was interesting because this entire genealogy is Jewish. Ruth was not a Jew. She actually was a Gentile, which means non-Jew. But even more specifically, Ruth was a Moabite. Now, a Moabite would have been despised by Jews, okay? There was a lot of racial tension between Jews and non-Jews in that time. So the fact that we see Ruth here, who was a non-Jew, even more so, she was a Moabite who was considered cursed by God from being a sinful people. And here Ruth is found in the genealogy of Jesus. Interesting. Look at verse 6. It says, and Jesse, the father of King David, and David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Okay? Doesn't even say her name here, right? Completely excludes her name here. Her name was Bathsheba, by the way. They knew that. It's not like it was a secret. But the author specifically said had been Uriah's wife. What the author is trying to point out is he wanted to point out the story behind Bathsheba here. You see, David would have been considered by the Jews to be like the most awesome king of all time. They thought David was like just awesome. But what the author here is pointing out is that David wasn't as awesome as you think he was. David was a liar. He was a murderer. In fact, the story here around Uriah is basically this. Basically, David shacked up with Uriah's wife, okay? She got pregnant, and then David had her husband killed on the battlefield. That's Uriah. He was killed because of David's adultery and lying. So what in the world is going on here? There's 4 women highlighted here in these verses, And none of them you would consider to be like typical expected women to be in the genealogy, right? So what exactly is going on? You have a liar, you have a prostitute, you have a cursed outsider, you have an adulterer. Why? Why would God do this? I truly believe it's to highlight one very significant thing: the grace of God. The grace of God. What do I mean by that? See, many of you probably hear the word grace spoken about in culture and so on and so forth, but you probably don't really understand what it is. Grace is a free gift that we don't deserve. When spoken about in the Bible, primarily, it talks about a free gift that you don't deserve. Usually the favor of God is what's spoken about. Now, here what we see is these four women who deserve the wrath of God. They deserve no legacy whatsoever, but yet they're included in the genealogy of the most important person who's ever lived on earth. Why? I believe it's to highlight the grace of God. That God can take a broken mess like Tamar, like Bathsheba, who's considered I can't get his name out. Uriah's wife. A broken mess of a situation, and God can redeem that for his good and for his glory. This is what the message of the gospel is all about, by the way. And I believe we see it here in the genealogy. That Jesus didn't come just to save good people. He came to save broken, broke down, hopeless, helpless people. And I believe there's many of us in here today that need to hear that. It don't matter what you did last week, last month, or last night. Jesus came. A new day has begun for people like you. Jesus hung out with sinners. He said, I came to seek and save the lost. See, the heart of the gospel, the heart of this factual event is that Jesus came for sinful people just like Rahab, right? He came for people who were broken. And this is significant for us. So you guys can write this down if you like. Jesus, born of sinners, lived without sin in order to save a sinner like me. Notice I use the word sin a lot there because what we see in the genealogy of Jesus is a bunch of sinful people, but still they brought about the fulfilled plan of God through his son Jesus and salvation. You see, many of you, I think you see yourself as maybe too far gone, either one, to be used by God, or two, to be saved by God. And I want to address both of those briefly. Many of us, even if you're Christians, you feel like, man, I'm damaged goods. Sure, I'll show up to church, I'll volunteer a little bit, but you see yourself kind of as a second-class citizen. But Jesus says, nope, you are chosen. You are my son, you are my daughter, in whom I'm well pleased. It's what he says about Jesus, his own son, and it's what he says about you if you are in him. It doesn't matter what you did yesterday. There's this freedom that comes from knowing Jesus. A new day has dawned for you, so live like it. Live like it. And for those of us in here who are considering Jesus, maybe you got invited here, maybe you just saw the sign out front, I don't know, or maybe you're watching online today because you're not sure about coming in person. Listen, a new day can dawn for you too. This is factual news. Jesus actually did come. He was born. He was both God, born as a baby, fully man, fully God. He came, he lived a perfect life, something none of us can do if we're being honest, right? We're all sinful. Might as well add our list to the name of the jacked up genealogy because none of us are perfect. But Jesus came precisely for people like us. And it's when you admit your sin, when you confess your sin, then you're at a place where you can receive Jesus. As long as we walk around thinking we're high and mighty and we're awesome and all of that, hey, guess what? Jesus will stay far from you. But guess what? When we humble ourselves, guess what the scriptures say? He will be near to you. He's always near when you humble yourself. When you admit that you're a sinner. When you run to him, guess what? His arms are always open wide for the sinner who runs to him. Because that's why he came. You see, when he died on the cross, something significant happened. He paid a sin debt that you and I can never pay. You probably didn't realize this if this is all new to you, but the story of the Bible is this, that you're sinful and God is holy. He's perfect. He's without sin. Sin can't be in his presence. So the bad news of this is that your sin deserves God's punishment. Your sin deserves the alienation from God forever. Many people will come up to me and say, Mark, I don't know why God feels so far away. It's because he is far away when you're a sinner. But the good news of this story is this is the reason that Jesus came. You see, when Jesus hung on the cross, listen, guys, he was taking the punishment that your sins deserve. Legally, he was taking the debt that you owe God that you can never pay. He was taking it away, right? That's what Jesus was doing when he died on the cross. You want to know why we call this a new day? Because you have that legal debt removed. Guess what? It's a new day. How many of you guys ever got out of debt in here? You know what that feels like? That's a freedom, isn't it? Man, that has nothing on receiving pardon from God himself for the sins you've committed. That's what Jesus did on the cross. Spiritually, he bridged the gap between you and God when he died on the cross and rose again from the dead. He made it possible for you to have a relationship with God. Judicially, he declares you innocent because of what he did on the cross and rising again from the dead. Eternally, he secures you and adopts you into his family. Hey, listen, but the thing is, if you have never received it, that's step one for you, is receiving his grace and his forgiveness. Sure, you could put your name on the list of genealogy of those who have a broken past, but listen, he came to redeem you. Now, how do we receive it? That's the question I want to talk about just for a moment as we close out today. I actually believe the answer is found right here in this genealogy. You're thinking probably, how much stuff can you pull out of a genealogy? Mark's a bunch of names. What's interesting here is, if you were paying attention or if you've ever read this before, is this is the genealogy of Joseph, Jesus' stepdaddy, basically. Now, why is that significant? Joseph is not Jesus' real daddy. If you don't know the story and you've been sleeping during Christmas all these years, it's fine. But Jesus was born of a virgin, Mary. She never, had relations with her soon-to-be husband, Joseph. So Joseph wasn't the real daddy of Jesus. So what's the big deal? Jesus was the adopted son of Joseph, basically, if we put it in our terminology today. God was his real daddy. So what does that mean for us? To be a part of the family of God, to have your name entered into the genealogy of Jesus after Jesus, guess what? It's not something you're born into. It's not a natural descent. You have to be born again. You have to be adopted into his family. Now, this can seem a little exclusive to some of us, especially if you hear it for the first time. You're like, what? Like, how come this is true? Like, how do I do that? Here's the good news. Listen, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to work for it. He says, to be adopted into my family, you receive it. You receive salvation freely by my grace through faith alone. And by this kind of faith, guys, hey, we're not talking about like, oh, blindly, I hope that something happens tomorrow. That's kind of a blind faith. No, this is a trusting faith. Just like when you came in and you sit down in that chair, you trust it would hold you up, you just sit down. Hey, Jesus says, put all of your trust in me. You're a sinner far from me, but I came for a sinner like you. I've taken the punishment that your sin deserves. I am here for you to save you if you trust me. So we put our trust in Jesus, and guess what? He says in that moment, we are born again. You are born into this genealogy of Jesus. You are now a child of the living God. A new day has dawned for you. And if that's you and you've never received him, hey, listen, that new day can be today. It can be today. Hey, let's pray together. God, there's so much good news in your word. God, the pages are filled with your goodness and your grace, Lord. And as I look at this genealogy, Lord, I'm just blown away with your grace, that you would choose people who are sinful, who have a marred past, and you would redeem them for your good. And God, I know there are people in here today who have never really understood and never received you. So, Lord, I pray for them. Lord, I pray that a new day would dawn in their heart today. pray they would receive you. And listen, when all eyes close and heads bowed, I want to speak to you just for a moment. If that is you, and there's no better time to receive the grace of the Lord than today. Salvation is right there at your fingertips. You may have been fighting it for weeks, months, years. I don't know. Maybe today's the first day you've understood you needed to be saved. But today's the best day because God right now stands before you with open arms. So if that's you and you feel him working in your heart today and you believe that this is all true, this is a factual news account, then I want to challenge you to pray to him right now and receive his forgiveness. Tell him in your own words. You can do this in your mind. You don't have to be out loud. You can just say, God, I believe you. I believe this message is true. That Jesus did come. That he was a baby that then one day later died on the cross. I believe that he rose again from the dead. And I believe that that work on the cross paid my debt penalty for me. So today, God, I ask you for your forgiveness based on what Jesus has done for me. And today, I receive your salvation. Thank you, Father, my new Father. Hey, listen, if this was you, let me speak to you just for a moment again with eyes closed, heads bowed. If this was you and today you received him, do not walk out of here without letting someone know that. Sure, this is a personal, spiritual thing between you and God, but receiving Jesus is never something to be done in isolation. It's something that the family of God is here for you for. So let us know. Let me know. Let someone close to you know. Let a family member know. Let someone know so that we can celebrate with you, so that we can join you, come alongside of you, and be with you to help you grow and to be the disciple that Jesus wants you to be. Lord, I also want to pray over all the believers in here, those who are already in your genealogy. Lord, I pray that we would live that way. Lord, I pray that we would believe this to be true as a true historical event, that you actually did these things, that you are, in fact, the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, and that today you reign. Pray that you would help us believe it. Pray you would help us live this way, God, that we would walk free of sin, that we would walk with a sense of urgency, because, God, you are real, and people around us every day are dying and going to hell. And Lord, I pray you would convict our hearts. Do not let us rest until we fully follow you and fully are invested in being a part of your kingdom coming to this earth. Give us power, Lord. Without your Holy Spirit, we can do nothing. We trust you. We love you. And it's in your grace we stand this day. In Jesus' name, amen.